More deaths as the northern Caucasus descends into increasing violence. But what are the root causes? Separatist sentiments or disenchantment with the governing regimes? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Garda. Violence in former Soviet states in the Caucasus region appears to be on the rise. This week, a suicide bomber hit a police station in Ingushetia. 20 people were killed and more than 130 injured in the attack in Ingushetia's main city, Nazran. The injured included many children from a nearby apartment block. The bomber reportedly drove his car full of explosives into the police compound before detonating his device. Ingushetia's leader has blamed militants for the attack. Russian President Dmitry Medvedev has sacked the region's interior minister. He said the attack could have been prevented. But this is not an isolated incident. Russia's North Caucasus has been plagued by violence in recent months. About a week ago, Ingushetia's construction minister, Ruslan Amirkhanov, was assassinated in his office by masked gunmen. In a separate incident, 3 employees of Russia's emergency ministry were shot dead. In late July, a suicide bomber killed 6 people and wounded at least 10 others in the capital of Chechnya. Earlier in that month, 9 officers were killed when militants firing machine guns and grenades ambushed a police convoy. In June, English President Yunusbek Yevkurov was severely wounded when a suicide bomber attacked his motorcade. And joining us today are our guests in Moscow, Masha Lipman, editor of the Pro et Contra journal, published by Carnegie Moscow Center. In Tbilisi, Zaza Gachecheladze, editor-in-chief of the Georgian newspaper The Messenger. And in London, Natalia Leshchenko, Russia and Eurasia analyst at Global Insight. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Let's start off with Natalia Leshchenko. Natalia, is the Republic in full-blown civil war at this moment in time?
It would be too wrong to call this a civil war. It's certainly a problem with insurgency. It's certainly a very severe security situation, but you don't have 2 hostile parties facing each other and trying to eliminate the other. So I wouldn't call it a civil war.
Okay, in trying to find out what's driving all of this, what would you say is the main reason for the violence?
Well, you can have 2 perspectives on this. One is the short-term one, in which you would say, and probably agree with the current president of Ingushetia, who said that the militias, the local militias, have responded to the crackdown by the official forces, by the police, and so that's like a culmination before actually the situation calms down. But if you look in a very long-term perspective, Russia has been trying to get hand of the Caucasus for a couple of centuries now, and they could never get it right.
Masha Lipman, would you agree with that?
Mostly, yes. I would say 2 main factors are involved here. One is that objectively North Caucasus is an extremely difficult challenge for Russia. This is a poor region. This is a region with very high unemployment. This is a region which consists of 6 administrative units called republics, and none of the 6 economies is viable. All of them rely heavily or mostly on allocations from Moscow. But on top of being a difficult problem and on top of being culturally very different from the rest of Russia, being more traditional, way less modern than Russia is, I think another factor on top of this is Russia's policies. Russia has heavily relied on loyal leaders to take care and to handle the problems there, and looked the other way at the methods those leaders were using. And mostly the methods used were heavy-handed, were brutal, thus breeding resistance.
Would you, sorry to interrupt you, would you go so far as to say that leaders like Yunusbek Yevkurov are seen as puppets by their own people?
Yevkurov is a separate case. Actually, Ingushetia is an interesting example because many years ago it had a leader who was regarded as a blessing for his people, was deeply respected and even worshipped by his people, which actually made President Putin, who was president at the time, wary because he drew his legitimacy from public popularity, which made him too independent to the Kremlin's taste. He was replaced by another person who was totally loyal to the Kremlin but fully incompetent, and it was under his guidance that the place became a cesspool of violence. Yevkurov has just been appointed. He was a replacement for the incompetent previous leader, and he only just started. Experts of the region say that actually his first attempts were at least thorough. At least he wanted to do good to his people, but his attempts were cut short very soon after his start. His life was attempted, and he nearly was killed in this terrorist attack.
Natalia Lishchenko, just to try and make something absolutely clear, the people don't necessarily want to secede from Russia, do they? Particularly in Ingushetia.
Exactly, that's the main point of difference with Chechnya here. Actually, Yevkurov is highly respected. The current president is highly respected within the country because he's an Ingush himself. He's from there. He understands the local people, and he seems to genuinely care about the situation and try to get things right. He has only been in the place for a year, as we mentioned, and the whole fact that an assassination attempt was done on him actually suggests that he started making a difference in the country. So in that sense, he's no puppet of Kremlin in the terms of being someone completely sort of disengaged from the population. This is not the case at the moment.
Okay, let's take that. Sorry to interrupt
what was
you.
The other question?
Let's take that point and put it to Zazagachi Chilat. Say that Yevkurov is in no way a puppet of the Kremlin, and the fact that they tried to kill him was actually because he was making a difference.
Well, actually, could I go a little bit in the background of the event? Because when a patient has severe pain, he's not only treated with painkiller, but he should be examined very thoroughly, and it should be identified what is the cause and what are the reasons of such developments. When I say that, I mean that it's not only the personalities and likes and dislikes of some simple, ordinary people of Ingushetia, whether they like the minister or the president or someone, but it's much deeper, I guess. I suppose that it all is connected with the general policy Russia is conducting since the collapse of the Soviet Union, by encouraging separatism in the neighboring country, Georgia, and inspiring it and supporting it and promoting it. In reality, Russia backfired itself, and this is the results of such developments, that Russia, in fact, encouraging separatism in Georgia undermined its own policy, because in fact northern Caucasus has always been the weak point of Russian policy in the Caucasus, and this is now awoken, and these are the results which Russia itself promoted by encouraging separatism in Georgia.
Okay, let's put this to Marsha. I'd like to bring in Marsha Lipman before we come back to Natalia. Marsha, is that a fair point, that Russia is contradictory because it encourages separatism elsewhere, for example in Georgia, but it crushes dissent within its own republics, like in Ingushetia or Chechnya?
Well, I would say separatism is not an issue here. In fact, or if it is, it's a minor factor. In fact, none of the 6 republics today is seeking a secession. Even in Chechnya, people do not seek to secede, and not least because they heavily rely on Moscow for money. The bulk of their budgets comes from the federal center. So without the allocations from Moscow, they would not be viable. So secessionists may be partly the problem in Chechnya, but certainly not elsewhere. We are facing here a combination of different reasons for people to get violent. There may be clannish problems, there may be blood feuds, there may be people distressed and desperate because their relatives fell victim of police brutality. There may be indeed radical religious extremists. There may be any number of people with their various grievances and various goals. The point of the matter is
you're mentioning all these reasons. Let's try and say, boil this down to maybe 3 core issues: poverty, radical Islamism, and heavy-handedness of the security forces. Out of those 3, which one would you say is the chief driving force for this unrest in Ingushetia?
Well, I would say in Ingushetia it has become a vicious circle of the heavy-handed operation of the government and police officials antagonizing the people. People take revenge and punitive measures follow, and this vicious circle of violence continues. So I would say police brutality and incompetence of the local government is the chief reason in Ingushetia, even though other problems also exist.
Natalia Leshenko, you want to come in there?
Yes, I would say that there are actually 2 kinds of separatism, or if you want, we can name these as 2 main problems. One is the cultural difference, which we have talked about, and another, rather, are the opportunities for organized crime. There are still economic opportunities in those countries, and that was the driving force behind the Chechen mobilization, one can argue, in the 1990s. And here you have a similar situation in this in the conditions when the federal forces they can be seen as brutal, but at the same time they can be seen as weak because they cannot handle the situation. This context creates a very prolific ground for organized crime, and it's actually the paramilitaries belonging to these groups seek sometimes independence, or they take up the slogans of separatism without it actually having sort of any proper grounds or popular following. So I would say it's cultural difference and organized crime.
Zaza Gachicheladze, both the other guests are saying that separatism isn't too much of an issue here, or secession as such from Russia. Looking at the facts, 90% of Ingushetia's revenue comes from Moscow. It can't really do without Moscow, can it?
Yes, but it's very difficult to believe that person only takes as major motivation some economic issues and goes and kills 20 policemen or attacks president or any high official of the country, of the republic, and these are only reasons. It's very difficult to agree with such argument. So I still think that there is major argument, which is the separatism motivations and moods in the population, in Chechnya in particular, and in Ingushetia, which has been starting right now, and which is the major, I should say, motivation.
Well, let's try and look a bit deeper into the background now, just for a little bit. Since the fall of the USSR, Russia has retained a large amount of control over those former satellite states. Many have Kremlin-backed leaders, and their economies often rely on trade from Russia. But not all of these states are happy about Russia's ongoing influence. Separatists in Chechnya forced Russian troops out in the mid-1990s and gained de facto independence. But Russia did not relinquish control, and fighting has continued ever since. Chechnya's president is strongly supported by Moscow and has been accused of human rights violations. Last year, Russia went to war with another former Soviet state, Georgia, over the breakaway republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The 2 smaller territories had been partly under Russian control, and when Georgia attempted to wrest control back, Russia violently intervened. Now it seems anti-Russian violence has spilled over into Ingushetia. Well, our guests are still with us. Let's bring in Marsha Lipman. Marsha, with Ingushetia at this moment in time, do you expect Moscow to respond like that proverbial wounded bear? Is it iron fist time?
Well, I hope not, and I don't think the Kremlin actually is yearning for waging war once again in North Caucasus. I think the Kremlin opted for this policy that in the case of Chechnya was called Chechenization, and in fact this is a policy that Russia has pursued all over in North Caucasus, in all the 6 republics, relying on a loyal leader and looking the other way, being reluctant to look deep into the problem that Natalia mentioned, that I fully agree with, the problem of corruption, which breeds crime, and the problem of cultural differences and a different cultural and religious environment over there, not least something that we haven't touched upon. These are the regions with scores of ethnic groups, and the relations between the ethnic groups being tense or sometimes hostile, and Russia was unwilling and reluctant to deal with the problems thoroughly, instead relying on those rulers, looking the other way at the embezzled funds and at the corruption and at how exactly they manage their territories. So from a situation in which Russia actually hoped to get away with just delivering funds and appointing loyal leaders, to getting deeply involved in the region once again militarily. I don't think this is what Russia seeks. I think Russia would want to avoid that. The question is whether Russia would actually be able to pursue the same policy for much longer without seeing its first goal not to be fulfilled. And the first goal was, of course, to contain the violence within North Caucasus so that terrorism activity and subversive acts would not spill over to Russia at large.
Natalia Lishenko, Human Rights Watch accused Russian federal forces of, quote, dirty war tactics and Chechnya-style operations in Ingushetia, including torture of suspects, kidnapping of journalists, and suppression of political opposition. Is that a fairly accurate portrayal of what's going on in Ingushetia?
I think it would be difficult to comment very correctly on the reports because, say, I personally haven't been there, and comparing to what we hear, we can certainly allow for a fair degree of police brutality. After all, in Russia things, methods can be fairly rough. But I think it would be fair to say that Kremlin is not interested in making Ingushetia or the neighboring countries, for that matter, a sort of an empty field. They do want security there, and they actually do want economic prosperity for those regions so that they stop being a hotbed of problems for them and for Moscow and the constant source of embarrassment. It's just, so it's not an ethnic issue. There's a major ethnic misunderstanding, but it's not that it's some kind of an ethnic conflict between Russians and the others. And in Ingushetia, this has been seen very clearly. There has not been any major rivalry between the Russian ethnic groups and the Ingushetian ethnic groups. So here we have an attempt to put the situation under control, and most importantly the economic situation under control, and Russia is being very awkward, as it often is.
Let's bring in Zaza in Tbilisi. Zaza, Natalia says that the Kremlin wants security and economic prosperity for Ingushetia. What do you think?
Well, you know, the grudge against Soviet Union, particularly in Ingushetia, comes from the 1944, when almost all the Ingush nation was deported from the territory it is occupying now to Kazakhstan and other Siberian places. And only in the mid-50s they were returned. So the dissatisfaction and discontent is here. And I would agree that there are some minor issues like economic issues, cultural differences, and so on. But major thing is the Russian attempt to subordinate and suppress any kind of national identity appearance in the North Caucasus.
Okay, let's ask Marsha Lipman about that. Marsha Lipman, is there this concerted Russian attempt to suppress the identity, to destroy the identity of the people?
No, I think, in fact, there is not enough care, cultural care included, from the part of Russia. Actually, Russia looks the other way. Russia looks at those territories actually increasingly demodernizing and slipping back into traditional ways and traditional law, into defiance of the laws and constitution of Russia. It is not about Russifying these places. In fact, exactly the opposite is true. Because Russia ignores the needs of the people. I want to point out to your previous question to Natalia, it is not the Russian military that brutalized the people in Ingushetia. It is the Ingush police, and this is part of the same issue, of the same Russian policy. Russia wants it to be the problem of the Ingush government, not of the Russian government, so as not to antagonize the people there against Russia, not to breed anti-Russian sentiments, and thereby to keep Russia secure, or to keep the fragile security of Russia, so as we do not have major terrorist attacks in the Russian territory.
Okay, before we wrap this up, Natalia, I want to bring in the religious angle here. I was going through one of the websites, one of the more extreme websites, the Caucasus website, English language. It mainly shows its support of Chechnyan militants. It refers to the Ingush dead in this recent attack as apostates, the suicide attackers as martyrs, the Russians as infidels. How much support do you think this sort of ideology has amongst the Ingush people?
This depends really also. I would also bring it down to some economic rationale as well. The degree of sort of the rise of the radical Islamist forces, not only in the North Caucasus but also in Central Asia, is very often directly proportional to the degree of the economic duress people have to suffer. So although it is obvious to say that the suicide bombing tactic is very often linked to radical Islamism, this is not something that would be the only reason. I would say religion is important, but it shouldn't be overplayed. I think it should be considered together with other factors such as the ethnicity, history, culture, so the whole bundle of things to make proper sense of it.
Zaza Gachicheladze, as a final thought, do you think that Russia has overplayed the religious aspect, which has suited its purposes?
Well, I believe that radical Islamism is one of the tools which is used by the separatism leaders of Chechnya and Ingushetia, and it is just manipulated. So this is my approach.
Final comment from Marsha Lipman. Marsha, we're running out of time. 30 seconds, please.
Right. I think the factor of radical Islam exists. It's not major, but it is overplayed by the local leaders, and this is the reason why they brutalize the people. They are so afraid of potential attacks by radical Islamists that they persecute those even vaguely suspected of ties with radical Islam, and this breeds revenge on the part of the population and the part of the relatives of the victims of police brutality.
Marsha Lipman, Zaza Gachicheladze and Natalia Leshchenko, thank you very much for joining us here for this discussion. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments, your suggestions and your questions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye-bye.
Everyone, this is People&Power, and I'm Sama El-Shahad. On today's program, between a rock and a hard place.
До того степени боевиков не боимся, как я недавно сказал, так как мы боимся этих сотрудников. Они до того степени страшно издеваются над народом, над мирными людьми.
For many of its 500,000 inhabitants, the tiny Russian Republic of Ingushetia has become a fearful and hellish place. Trapped in the middle of a decade-long dirty war between Islamic insurgents and the Moscow-backed security services, ordinary people have been indiscriminately tortured, abducted and murdered. It's a cycle of bloody atrocity and counter-atrocity that seems to have no end. Kremlin hawks portray the conflict as a necessary struggle against militant jihadi from neighboring Chechnya, bent on establishing an Islamic caliphate across the Caucasus. Others say that the situation is only this bad because aggrieved relatives have been seeking to avenge the brutality of the security services. Either way, the conflict has left many Ingushetians in despair, their human rights suppressed, and their faith in the authorities in tatters. Filmmakers Dom Rotherow and Anthony Butts have this report from a country where hope seems to have vanished. Some of the images are very disturbing.
Потому что опасно, тем более любой момент, любое время могут в камуфляжной форме оцепить, похитить.
Maksharip Alshev is talking about the security forces of Russia's southern republic of Ingushetia. As the leader of the civil opposition here, he knows he is a target.
Хотя оружие не защитит, но хоть успеешь сделать таким образом, чтобы тебя хоть не мучили, забирали, чтобы ты не пропадал без вести, бесследно, как пропадают все обычные люди здесь.
Recently, the Muslim Republic of Ingushetia has become the most dangerous place in the Russian Federation. Endemic corruption combined with a battle between Islamic extremists and security forces, seemingly accountable to no one, has plunged the area into violence. Trapped in the middle are 500,000 Ingush like Maksharip.
И даже сейчас не решил стать политиком, просто меня вынудили, потому что ведь я же тоже допустил огромную ошибку, как и все остальные, я тоже сидел, наблюдал.
Things changed for Maksharip 3 years ago when his nephew was snatched off a train by security forces for refusing to become an informant. One of Maksharip's sons happened to be with him at the time.
Ну как только у меня похитили сына и племянника, и вот я и вышел.
Maksharip rallied public protests, which led to the men's release. In the process, he also kicked off widespread civil opposition to the regime. Subsequent demonstrations were violently broken up, and Maksharip spent 6 months in prison.
С тех пор, как начали говорить правду, мы сидим на пороховой бочке. Любой день, любую минуту ждешь, что что-то с тобой случится или с семьей что-то случится.
One of Ingushetia's biggest problems is that it shares a border with Chechnya. While the Ingush stayed out of the Chechens' recent wars for independence from Russia, this didn't stop the violence from finally spilling over.
Чеченские и ингушские муджахеды провели совместную операцию по всей территории.
In June 2004, rebels attacked Ingushetia's main city of Nazran and killed scores of security officials. With Russia by then pretty much in control of Chechnya, the rebels wanted to spread the war into the neighboring Muslim republics. And in Ingushetia, discontent had been growing ever since Vladimir Putin installed the hugely unpopular Murat Zyazikov as president there in 2002. According to Magomed Mutsulgov of local human rights group Masha, it was then that anyone vaguely suspected of opposing the regime started getting visits from the security forces.
Вы посмотрите на этого человека. Вот он самый первый ингуш, который пропал на территории Ингушетии в 2002 году. Ему тогда было 77 лет. Зачем военным было его забирать? Он простой человек, который разводил пчел.
Magomed co-founded Masha when his younger brother also disappeared 4 years ago.
Все эти случаи, это люди, которые исчезли вообще. Но сам факт похищения было больше 500, а часть из этих людей находили уже мертвыми.
The violence has been increasing exponentially. Masha estimates that 212 people were killed in 2008. By August this year, that number had already been reached. Batir Albakov, a 26-year-old aeroplane engineer, was abducted in July.
Ну вот, я же говорю, где-то около 5:30 постучались в дверь, сказали, что Назрановская РОВД, проверка паспортный режим. Ну, паспорт проверили, вы должны с нами проехать. В Орштах его убитого оттуда нашли. Нам ничего никто не сообщал. Мы в интернете прочитали.
On the internet, the authorities claimed that Batir had been killed in a shootout with the police.
Была одета камуфляжная форма, хотя все соседи видели, когда его из дома забирали, что он был одет в гражданскую форму. Как такое может быть, если на 2 машинах люди его вооруженные до зубов забрали? Как он мог от них сбежать и попасть в лес, мы вообще не понимаем. Откуда у него появился автомат, как он был переодет в камуфляжную форму?
Batir's family buried him just 3 days ago.
Чем заниматься молодежи? Жить нам дальше мирно, нас все равно не оставляют в покое. Каждый раз, каждый день слышим, кого-то убили, кого-то застрелили.
Это старший у меня, сейчас работает в МЧС. Я вот сейчас за него тоже боюсь. Вот он был на дежурстве в этот день. Я из-за него даже боялась. Даже я думаю, я вот так думаю, что они его забрали бы.
С этой властью...
Батыром такое произошло, значит, может с любым произойти. Вот это я хочу. Потому что вины за ним никакой не было.
Вот после того, как мы сообщили им, что у нас так увели человека, ни один участковый, ни один следователь, ни один из властей не явился сюда осмотреть ее.
When Petiment leaves the room, Batir's sisters show us the wounds on him they photographed in the morgue. For fear of their mother's weak heart, they haven't told her that it seems her son was horrifically tortured before he died.
Она его видела спереди, а спереди у него было на сердце рана была и здесь, а все раны у него были ниже и со спины.
Вот это ножевое, это порез ножом. В бою он не может получить вот эту, вот смотрите, как отрезана рука. Это не случайный осколок, там, это не пуля. Видно, что это пытки, вот смотрите. Вот. Вы понимаете, на мой взгляд, их похищают только с единственной целью. Пытать, если они там возьмут на какие-то преступления себя, то возьмут. Если не возьмут, то их, они умрут от пыток и их где-нибудь закопают. Все.
Они убивают, они уводят людей для статистики. Мне так кажется. Именно для статистики. Что вот, мол, мы работаем, что мы ловим боевиков, им же нельзя без дела сидеть. Им нужно или пойти в лес поймать боевиков, или поймать мирного жителя и сказать, что он боевик. Им это абсолютно без разницы.
Самое страшное, что за вот эти вот похищения или убийства не привлечен за все эти годы ни один сотрудник спецслужб. Какие бы доказательства не были, какие бы улики бы не были, даже если их за руку ловят, ни один сотрудник спецслужб не привлечен к уголовной ответственности в соответствии с российским законодательством.
Yet the violence of the security forces is only one side of Ingushetia's mayhem. In the last 7 years, the Islamic militants have killed over 200 security personnel and government officials. The most devastating attack happened this August, when a suicide bomber drove a truck into Nazran's main police station. 24 people were killed and over 160 injured. In recent years, religious extremists within the rebels have turned the war for Chechen independence into a jihad for a Sharia-based emirate covering all of Russia's Caucasian Muslim republics. They are now also targeting those civilians whom they deem as un-Islamic. A few days ago, 2 sisters, aged 52 and 60, were shot to death in this roadside kiosk, supposedly for selling alcohol.
Но где это алкоголь не продается? Да, в каких странах не продается? В каких городах не продается?
Запрещено это, что ли? Это не запрещено ведь?
Вот они одну убили женщину, вот эту. Зина. Вот вторая сестра. Фатима. Они работали, продавали, стояли на своем рабочем месте. А вечером младшая сестра собралась идти домой и зашла к старшей. Вот их там и на месте расстреляли.
Кто сжигал?
Сжигали киоски, магазины сжигали.
Взрывали они не только здесь, в разных местах Ингушетии они этим делом занимались.
Даже вместе с продавцами они сжигали магазины.
Это какие-то психически ненормальные люди. Взять женщин, взять по 5-6 пуль, всаживать по 7-8 пуль. Какой шариат? Никакой, ну о чем, при чем здесь шариат?
Нам уже нечего бояться. Мы уже это все прошли. Мы потеряли родителей, потеряли мужей, потеряли. За что нам теперь бояться? Нам уже нечего терять.
Yet even this family lay the final blame less on the militants than on the authorities and the corruption and lawlessness that President Zyazikov fostered. Ingushetia has become not only Russia's most violent republic, but also its poorest.
Zyazikov заявлял, что в республике построено 70 с лишним заводов, фабрик, что у нас, значит, решен вопрос безработицы, ну и многое-многое. И мы, рискуя своей жизнью, пытались доказать руководству России, что нет никаких заводов, что деньги, огромные деньги, которые выделялись нам, просто так, ни за что эти деньги расхищались Zyazиковым и его окружением.
By 2008, opposition to President Zyazikov had grown to such a pitch and the violence and corruption become so brazen that Moscow finally replaced him with the popular ex-general Yunusbek Yevkurov. The new leader set out to tackle the corruption and violence and brought into his administration advisors from the civil opposition, like Kaloy Ahilgov, his new press secretary.
Нужно наказывать чиновников, которые проявили себя в коррупционных моментах. В общем, делать все, чтобы восстановить доверие населения. И все. Как только этот баланс будет восстановлен, как только люди почувствуют заботу со стороны властей, я думаю, этот момент тоже спадет сам собой.
For most Ingush, President Yevkurov was a breath of fresh air. He sacked corrupt officials, tried to initiate talks with the rebels, and gained the public's trust. But on the 22nd of June this year, his presidential convoy was hit by a suicide bomber. Yevkurov ended up in a critical condition. In his absence, and with the Kremlin demanding even better results against the rebels, allegations of extrajudicial executions by the security forces have been flooding in. Another day, another funeral.
Вот здесь, на самом верху, вот здесь Ильяс Клиев находится, мой брат. Вот здесь находится его брат, Гирихан. Вот там с краю находится Урусхан, его брат. Вот они все, 4, которые ни с того ни с сего пропали.
Наших людей похитили, сотрудники ФСБ вывели со стороны дороги Очелков, которая ведет наше село. После поехала колонна за этой машиной.
Вчера утром эту машину горящую и взорвавшую нашли где-то на сопках, как они говорят. И там, говорят, были 4 тела, у них там взорвалось что-то у себя в машине. Одного в руке вот так были вот так, вот точно так же у него было в руках. Человек, который взорвался в машине, не мог иметь клочок травы в руках. А так, тихо, мирно, каждый день. Вот. Раз, два, три, раз, два, три. А в году 365 дней. И вот считайте.
The fact that these young men are related to those they have just buried has put them under threat too.
У нас в домах проходят обыски. Забирают людей, пацанов забирают. Меня тоже забрали. Вот. За то, что я там сказал, что вот как, что к чему, наши сотрудники дали меня по лицу били.
По ингушской культуре должен быть кровная месть.
Вчера мне задавали эти вопросы в нашем МВД, как там у вас насчет кровной мести, тогда, когда я еще не знал, что убили моего брата и еще 3 его друзей. Они мне говорят, а если убьют твоего брата, как ты будешь поступать? Я говорю, не знаю. Они хотели негативно от меня услышать, что вот я убил, я вот это. Ну, я ничего не сказал.
As Mansour's interrogators clearly knew, it is revenge that drives most young men to join the militants in the forests. Once there, they may get converted to extremist Islam, but the initial goal is to get a gun and make their own justice in a land where people have lost all faith in the legal system.
Вот они едут, УАЗики.
The grey Uazik trucks used by the security forces have become a forbidding presence on Ingushetia's roads. We take a trip in one to an army base in the mountains to get the soldier side of the story.
Сколько раз, я тебе сейчас покажу вот этот поворот, тут где-то 8 или 10 человек убито именно на этом месте. Обстреляли боевики колонну, военную колонну. Невидимый враг. Раньше боролись за свободу, за независимость. В Чечне было. А сейчас их вербуют. Когда постоянно, если тебе в голову капает кто-то Вот идеологию какую-нибудь. Вот мусульманский мир такой-то, такой-то, надо так-то, так-то делать. Я сам не знаю, что они там говорят именно.
Как у вас? Успешно или неуспешно?
Успешно.
Как его?
Ну, есть определенные результаты. Значит, уничтожены боевики, нейтрализованы, есть задержанные.
Some soldiers agree to talk to us more frankly, as long as we don't show their faces.
Есть кровная месть в Ингушетии, да? Например, ФСБ уничтожит бандита, а брат бандита хочет отомстить.
В таком случае за ним надо наблюдать, что он делает, где он, куда он ходит, внедряется он в эту группу или нет. Если он малейшее подозрение подает, надо его тоже поймать или ликвидировать.
Пытка. Как думаете?
Пытка, если он говорит все, что надо сотрудникам органов, то не надо его пытать. Если он не виновен, его либо отпускают, либо передают в другие спецструктуры, чтобы в дальнейшем поработали с ними.
Что это значит? Вы смеетесь?
Ну, они это свои работы выполняют. У них есть свои методы, чтобы у него получить информацию.
Например?
Ну, например, полоскать его, например.
Что это?
Нежно поговорить с ним. ФСБ, они делают такие работы.
Many believe it is Russia's FSB, the former KGB, that is orchestrating the cycle of violence here. Their agents have been caught firing on English policemen. This has raised suspicions that Moscow, which is ultimately the real power here, is deliberately keeping this fractious region destabilized in order to justify its controlling military presence. Others believe the motive is also the money that those in power can make from conflict.
Как говорится пословица русская, мутной воде ловить рыбу легче. Когда развязываются вот такие гражданскую войну, развязали они, чтобы было легче воровать эти деньги.
After this interview, Maktarit points out that we weren't the only ones to be filming.
И только сейчас они зашли, через эту дверь сейчас нас снимали, сотрудники там ФСБ работают везде.
Suspicion of the FSB here is reminiscent of Soviet times. We are warned to keep our heads down.
Вот стоит машина, кругом здесь спецслужбы, все прослеживается. Нужно очень внимательным быть, аккуратным быть, когда работаешь.
Aslanbek has good reason to be cautious. Several human rights campaigners have been killed in the North Caucasus in the last few years.
Наверное, следующий я. А какая нам разница? Мы знаем, что мы не жильцы. Рано или поздно все равно убьют.
Until that time, Aslanbek is being kept busy. Last night, this house belonging to the Chechnya family was surrounded by hundreds of members of the security forces.
Одна пуля там лежит.
5:45. Автомат.
According to the FSB, militants had been traced to the house and opened fire on the security forces. But everyone here denies that there was a firefight.
Ни одного пули нету. С той стороны вокруг посмотрите, окна целые все. Если были боевики, это беспредел.
Everyone here also agrees that Mrs. Hautova, her son Musa and his wife were the only people in the house last night.
Утро после 5 постучались в окно. Военные в масках. У меня ничего не было. Мы открыли двери, окна. Зашли везде, посмотрели. Один открыл, тут стоял один, туда бросил гранат. Я когда вот бросал гранат, они меня выбросили, больше не запустили. Муса здесь остался, мой сын.
The security forces occupied this house for the next 4 hours, during which time Mrs. Hautova and her neighbour heard several explosions. When the security forces left, having looted, among other things, a TV, car parts and 2 sheep, all she could find of her son was this stain on the carpet.
Здесь лежал, здесь убили его.
Весь крови, вот он полностью. Мы щеткой еще его почистили, весь крови. Умер, они стреляли, туда бросали.
Ой, он что, пасен,
Туда собрали.
When Mrs. Hautova was finally taken to the morgue, her son's body was so destroyed, he had to be identified by his fingerprints.
Они подозревали, что он был боевиком.
Да какой он боевик был?
Это что-то надо им сказать.
Против боевиков они не смеют.
Что-то надо
с мирными гражданами, они безоружными могут воевать.
Спокойно спал у себя дома.
Искусственно сделали боевиком.
Это нужно остановить, этот беспредел. Сколько матерей, сколько жен страдает из-за этих тварей. Если бы вы видели, как они на нас кричали, как будто мы совершили какое-то такое преступление.
Если бы я могла, я бы на куски, как с моего сына, их разорвала. У меня нет силы. Они это чувствуют.
Musa left behind him a month-old son.
Он до того степени счастлив был, что на землю даже ногу не ставил. До того рад был. А сейчас ребенок остался без отца.
Сколько идет вот эта вся война, вот это все, никогда не было, чтобы...
Как мы теперь должны это все терпеть? За что вы думаете, боевики в лес тянутся? Из-за таких беспределов от этих всяких сотрудников. Мы до того степени боевиков не боимся, как я недавно сказал, так как мы боимся этих сотрудников. Они до того степени страшно издеваются над народом, над мирными людьми.
During our time in Ingushetia, we tried to get interviews with the FSB, the Chief of Police, and various government ministers. Even the few who initially agree eventually turn us down. We get some idea why when we go to Max Sharip's after filming the Hautievs. He gives us disturbing news from a contact within Ingushetia's Committee for Security.
There's a hunt now going on for foreign journalists, and he mentioned specifically me by name, that I am preparing some kind of material that could be used for a tribunal, gathering evidence against security forces here. And that order was given yesterday to stop all journalists, check all the material and seize it all. And it's for this reason why we still have some luck that we're going to bug out of Ingushetia now.
Since we left Ingushetia, President Yevgorov has recovered from the attack on him and returned to office. He has since sacked his entire cabinet for making problems worse in his absence. But it is yet to be seen how far his promised reforms will go, or indeed how effective they can be in a land which both the militants and elements of Russia's power structures seem determined to keep on the boil.
On October 25th, Makshirep Alchev, the civil opposition leader featured in that report, was murdered by unknown gunmen who sprayed his car with fire from automatic weapons. A female relative was also badly wounded in the attack. Though deep in mourning, Makshirep Alchev's family agreed that we might show the film. His assassination highlights the continuing perils faced by anyone who seeks to defend basic freedoms in Ingushetia. That's it for this edition of People and Power. Until next time, goodbye.